Fucking dying. Excuse me. What's up, everybody? Welcome to Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast. And I'm your host, Mike Lucht. Today is the day where all the talk stops. Well, no, I mean, obviously I'm going to be talking, but talking about the upcoming Saturn series. Today is the start, the first episode of several loosely connected episodes that build the Saturn series. Now, at first glance, you might not think off the top of your head, just taking your first glance, that this has anything to do with Saturn worship. But I guarantee you, keen-eared listeners, please hang in there with me, because all of this points towards what I can only imagine is the modern-day remains of Saturnian worship, the Saturnian currents. It's not, I don't know, this is kind of what I was like alluding to last episode with the idea of ritual murders, and like ritual being so deeply ingrained in our subconscious mind, the collective unconscious, that these things sort of exert themselves through us into the real world in ways that aren't quite overt. There doesn't necessarily have to be a secret Saturn cult for these Saturnian currents to work themselves into the real world to wreak havoc. And I'm going to do several episodes leading up to what will be the Game of Saturn, which is probably the best work I've ever found about a Saturnian cult in existence. And it all hinges on the Italian Renaissance era. That's where you'll see it in its most purest form. But these Saturnian currents still exert themselves through humans in various ways. It's just far more insidious than you would think. Once again, there doesn't have to be an overt Saturnian cult, but these things, they do happen. Shit happens. Saturnian shit happens. That's why today we're starting with the alternate theories behind the death of the Lindbergh baby. I know it's Lindbergh, but I just like saying Lindbergh baby. Anyways, this episode has to deal with the spirit of St. Louis, the potential ritual child sacrifice of the Lindbergh baby, spooky eugenics, a little Nazi utopia, experimental Nazi utopia called Fordlandia. Note, it was a gigantic, idiotic mistake. Anywho, let's get into this ritual sacrifice of the Lindbergh baby. Cut that cheese! In the early evening of March 1st, 1932, a 20-month-old child was taken from his crib in a second-floor nursery of a newly constructed estate in Hopewell, New Jersey. The father was Charles Lindbergh, the most famous man in the world, the Lone Eagle, who crossed the Atlantic alone 5 years earlier and became, through the single act of courage and machinery, something approaching a god in the American imagination. Child's mother was Anne Morrow Lindbergh, daughter of a diplomat and a poet. One paid more than the other. Herself an accomplished aviator and writer as well, which I did not know. The child was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., heir to the first American dynasty of celebrity, born into a spotlight so intense that his very existence seemed to belong not to him, nor his parents, but to the public that had claimed ownership over the Lindbergh name. What happened that night has been called the crime of the century. Got a lot of contenders. A ladder was found leaning against the house, leading up to a window that had been forced open. A ransom note demanded $50,000. For 2 months, the nation held its breath, clutched the pearls, while the father negotiated with shadowy intermediaries, while the police chased leads across multiple states, while the press camped outside the estate gates and turned the tragedy into a daily spectacle, proving that the news media have always been vultures. Then in May, the child's body was discovered in a shallow grave 4 miles from the house he was taken from, his skull fractured, his remains partially decomposed, lying in a ditch beside a rural road. A German carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann was arrested, tried, convicted, and executed in the electric chair at Trenton State Prison in 1936. He maintained his innocence until the very end, and for decades, that was the story. A tragic kidnapping, a botched ransom exchange, a dead child, an executed criminal, and a nation shaken but moving on, traumatized forever. But beneath this narrative, like a current running dark and silent beneath the surface of a calm river, there has always been another story. Not the story of a random crime, nor of a poor immigrant's opportunism, but of something far more disturbing, a story about eugenics and medical experimentation, about mysticism and the occult, about the intersection of science and superstition in the minds of early 20th century elites who believed themselves capable of remaking not just the world, but the human species itself. A story about a father who may have sacrificed his son, not to a kidnapper, but to an idea. About a surgeon who believed in miracles and telepathy, who designed gas chambers for the unfit. About an industrial utopia in the Amazon jungle that collapsed into madness and revolt. And about the possibility that the most famous kidnapping in American history was never a kidnapping at all, but a cover-up for something so dark that even 80 years later we can barely bring ourselves to look at it directly. This is that story. To understand what might have really happened in Hopewell, New Jersey in the spring of 1932, we must first understand the world into which Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was born. It was a world intoxicated by flight, by speed, hot, nasty speed, according to Eleanor Roosevelt, by the promise of technology to transcend human limitation, and it was a world increasingly seduced by dangerous ideas about human perfection. Charles Lindbergh had merely flown across the Atlantic. He had done so alone in a single-engine monoplane built by mail-order catalog, navigating by dead reckoning and intuition through fog and storms that should have killed him, hallucinating, talking to people that weren't there. When he landed at the Bourget Field in Paris on May 21st, 1927, he was 25 years old, and he had become the most celebrated human being on the planet. Ticker tape parade in New York drew 4 million people. He received the Medal of Honor. Foreign governments awarded him their highest decorations. He was offered millions in endorsement deals, in movie contracts, in book advances, and he turned almost all of it down. Almost all of it. This was part of his appeal. Lindbergh represented a certain ideal of American masculinity that the country desperately wanted to believe in. The modest hero, the technological pioneer who remained pure somehow, unsullied by the corruption of fame, devoted to his craft and to the future of aviation. He was tall, handsome, soft-spoken, and physically, quote-unquote, perfect. The press made much of his 6'3" frame, his athlete's build, his Nordic features. Here, they implied, was the American future. Healthy, bold, scientifically advanced, and genetically superior. But Lindbergh was not merely a pilot. He was a true believer in the religion of flight, and the religion came with a theology that would, in retrospect, look increasingly sinister. Aviation medicine, that term keeps coming to mind. Aviation medicine, look at the weird history of aviation medicine. It's quite interesting. Lindbergh believed that aviation wasn't simply a mode of transportation, but a force that would transform human civilization, breaking down national boundaries, creating a new world order. in enabling the next stage of human evolution. And like many of his contemporaries in the 1920s and 30s, Lindbergh believed that evolution needed a little nudge, not a kick right in the ass. Eugenics was not a fringe movement in early 20th century America. It was a mainstream science taught at Harvard and Yale, endorsed by the Supreme Court, practiced by state governments that forcibly sterilized tens of thousands of citizens deemed genetically unfit. The American Eugenics Society held conferences that attracted thousands of attendees. Major corporations funded research into racial hygiene, whatever the fuck that means. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Institution, and other pillars of American philanthropy poured millions into studying human heredity with the explicit goal of improving the race, I assume they mean human race, through selective breeding, quote-unquote selective breeding. Lindbergh didn't merely dabble in these ideas. He was a committed eugenicist who believed that the future of civilization depended on preserving the genetic purity of superior stocks and preventing the reproduction of the unfit. The unfit. What is the unfit? Who deems who unfit? How? Why? Etc. He wrote articles warning of racial degeneration. He corresponded with leading eugenicists in America and Europe. And as the 1930s progressed, he would find common cause with the Nazi regime in Germany, accepting a medal from Hermann Göring in 1938 and making speeches that warned of Jewish influence on American foreign policy and media. This was the man who in 1929 married Anne Morrow, the daughter of Senator Dwight Morrow. Their union was celebrated as the perfect joining of American genetic lines. The heroic aviator and the brilliant aristocratic daughter of the Eastern establishment, American aristocracy. Their first child, born in 1930, was named Charles Augustus after his father, and from the moment of his birth, he was subject to a scrutiny that no child could possibly deserve. The Lindberghs had tried to escape the relentless attention of the press by building a secluded estate in the hills of Hopewell, New Jersey, far from the photographers who had hounded them since the transatlantic flight. But even there, they couldn't find peace. The house was under construction in 1932, and the family was spending most of their time at the Morrow estate in Inglewood, visiting Hopewell only on weekends. On the evening of March 1st, they were preparing to return to Inglewood when the nurse, Betty Gow, discovered that the child was missing from his crib. The scene that greeted police was immediately suspicious, though not in the ways that would later fuel conspiracy theories. The nursery window was open. A makeshift ladder was found outside, leaning against the house, but oddly constructed and apparently unused. The rungs were too narrow to support an adult's foot, and there were no marks in the soft ground beneath it to suggest it had borne weight. The baby had been sleeping in a crib near the window, wrapped in a blanket. He had a cold, and the nurse had given him medicine earlier in the evening. His mother had heard no sound, despite sleeping in the room next door. His father had been downstairs and claimed to have heard nothing until the nurse came down to tell him the child was gone. Within hours, the estate was swarming with reporters, police, and federal agents. Lindbergh took immediate and total control of the investigation, dictating which officers could enter which rooms, refusing to allow standard forensic procedures, and insisting on managing all contact with the alleged kidnappers himself. Nothing weird about that. He's a hero. Let him do his thing. This behavior would later strike many observers as strange, even for a father in shock. Rather than deferring to law enforcement professionals, Lindbergh seemed to be running his own parallel investigation, using intermediaries he selected personally, making decisions that consistently compromised the chain of evidence. The ransom notes that began arriving were bizarre, written in a crude attempt at German-accented English, demanding $50,000. Lindbergh insisted on handling the negotiations himself, eventually delivering the money through a series of intermediaries, including a retired school principal and a shady figure named John Condon, who claimed to have made contact with the kidnappers. The money was paid. The child was not returned. And for 72 days, the nation watched as the most famous man in the world begged for the return of his son. Then, on May 12th, a truck driver named William Allen stopped to relieve himself in a wooded area near Mount Rose, New Jersey, about 4 miles from the Lindbergh estate. He discovered a small body, partially buried in leaves. The skull was fractured. The left leg was missing, apparently carried off by animals. The hands and feet were missing as well. The body was badly decomposed, but the clothing matched what the child had been wearing. A blanket was wrapped around the torso. Lindbergh identified the body himself, reportedly by recognizing a distinctive stitch pattern in the clothing. He then insisted on immediate cremation, preventing a thorough autopsy by independent pathologists. The child's remains were burned, the ashes scattered, and the physical evidence of whatever had truly happened to Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was reduced to ash and memory. 2 years later, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German carpenter with a criminal record in his home country, was arrested after passing one of the ransom bills. In his garage, police found over $14,000 of the ransom money hidden in a shoebox. Handwriting experts testified that his writing matched the ransom notes. A board from his attic appeared to match a section of the ladder found at the crime scene. He was convicted and executed, still protesting his innocence, still claiming that he had found the money from a business partner who had since died. The case was closed, but the questions never stopped. To understand the darkest theories about the Lindbergh kidnapping, we must confront a possibility that most historical treatments avoid: the suggestion that Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was not the perfect child that myth required him to be. According to researchers who have examined the medical records and contemporaneous accounts, the Lindbergh baby may have been born with physical abnormalities that would have been devastating to a father who believed with religious intensity in the importance of genetic perfection. These researchers, including retired Judge Lise Pearlman and historian Lloyd C. Gardner, have suggested that the child suffered from mild rickets, a condition caused by vitamin D deficiency that results in soft bones and skeletal deformities. They note that the child's skull bones may not have fully fused at the proper rate, that his head was unusually large, that his toes overlapped, that he showed signs of developmental delays that would have marked him, in the eugenicist worldview, as genetically damaged, a disappointment to the bloodline. In the context of 1930s eugenics, having a disabled or imperfect child wasn't merely a personal tragedy. For a public figure like Lindbergh, it was a potential scandal that undermined the very image upon which his fame rested. The lone eagle was supposed to represent genetic superiority, the triumph of the healthy Nordic type. A sickly child suggested weakness in the bloodline, a taint that could not be allowed to propagate. This isn't to say that Lindbergh would have necessarily viewed his own son with contempt, but it is to suggest that he may have viewed the child's condition through a lens that made certain unthinkable possibilities thinkable. If the child was imperfect, if he represented a genetic flaw in the otherwise superior Lindbergh line, then his fate might be considered differently than that of a perfect heir. And here we must introduce the second figure in this story, a man who would become Lindbergh's closest collaborator in the years following the kidnapping, and whose presence in the narrative transformed the crime from a simple kidnapping into something far stranger and more disturbing. Dr. Alexis Carrel was, by 1932, one of the most famous surgeons in the world. Born in France in 1873, he had won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1912 for his pioneering work in vascular suturing. The techniques he developed made organ transplantation theoretically possible for the first time in human history. He had worked during World War I developing antiseptic techniques that saved thousands of lives. He had written books that sold millions of copies, and he had done something that should have ended his scientific career, but instead launched him into a peculiar kind of mystical fame. And yet today, he remains a phantom of history. Strange, no? In 1902, as a young agnostic physician, Carrel had traveled to the Marian Shrine at Lourdes, France, to investigate claims of miraculous healing. He was skeptical, expecting to find fraud or hysteria. Instead, he witnessed something that he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. A woman named Mary Bailey, suffering from advanced tuberculosis periodontitis. Her abdomen distended with fluid, her body racked with fever, was brought to the shrine. After water from the spring was poured over her, Carrel watched as her abdomen visibly deflated. Her fever broke, and within 30 minutes, she was sitting up, eating, apparently cured of a condition that should have been fatal. Carrel didn't convert to simple Catholic piety. Instead, he developed a theory that he would refine over decades of research and meditation. He believed that the human body was governed by forces that modern science couldn't yet measure, that consciousness was not confined to the brain, but could extend beyond the physical body, and that under certain conditions, i.e. intense prayer, extreme emotional states, deep meditation, etc., the mind could influence matter in ways that violated the known laws of physics. He believed in telepathy and clairvoyance, and the ability of the human consciousness to project itself across space and time. He believed that the miracles at Lourdes were real, but that they represented a biophysical phenomenon, a form of energy generated by collective faith that could accelerate cellular repair, compressing months of natural healing into mere minutes. This was the man who, in the late 1920s, became Charles Lindbergh's closest friend and collaborator. The two men met through the Rockefeller Institute in New York, where Carrel had established a laboratory. Lindbergh was fascinated by the possibility of extending human life through technology, overcoming the body's natural limitations. Ring some bells. I think there's some people today who are in that same boat. Carrel was fascinated by Lindbergh's physical perfection, his embodiment of the vital energy that Carrel believed modern civilization was destroying. Together, they embarked on a project that would consume both men for years, the development of the Lindbergh perfusion pump, a device designed to keep organs alive outside the human body. The pump circulated a blood substitute through excised organs, maintaining them in a state of viability that allowed for extended surgical procedures and, theoretically, the preservation of organs for transplantation. It was a remarkable achievement, a precursor to modern heart-lung machines and organ preservation technology. But according to some researchers, the collaboration between Lindbergh and Carrel went far beyond mechanical engineering. They suggest that the two men shared a worldview that saw human life as material to be worked upon, shaped, improved, or discarded, according to the needs of scientific progress and racial hygiene. And they suggest that this worldview may have had devastating consequences for Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. To understand what might have happened to the Lindbergh baby, we must understand the man who may have been present at his death. Alexis Carrel wasn't merely a brilliant surgeon. He was a mystic, a vitalist, a believer in the hidden potentials of human consciousness who happened to possess the technical skills of a Nobel laureate. His worldview combined the rigorous empiricism of the operating theater with beliefs that most of his scientific colleagues would have dismissed as superstition. Carrel believed that the human body was an energy field, an integrated system of vital forces that could not be reduced to mere chemistry and physics. His famous experiments keeping chicken heart tissue alive in culture for decades convinced him that biological immortality was possible, that cells need not age and die if their environment was properly maintained. He believed that modern industrial civilization was causing a degeneration of the human species, that the pace of modern life, the artificial environments, the synthetic foods, were destroying the vital rhythms that had sustained humanity for millennia. And he believed that the solution to this degeneration wasn't democracy nor social reform, but the establishment of a biological aristocracy, a ruling class of superior men who would guide the evolution of the species through eugenics, euthanasia, and the elimination of the unfit. In 1935, Carrel published a book that would become a global bestseller and that would reveal the full extent of his dark vision. The book was called Man, the Unknown, and it argued that modern science had failed to understand the nature of human life. Physics and chemistry had advanced rapidly, Carrel wrote, but the science of living beings lagged far behind. Modern humans had built a world suited for machines, not for the complex biological and spiritual needs of the human organism. The book contained proposals that read, in retrospect, like a blueprint with the Nazi regime that was then consolidating power in Germany. Carrel advocated for voluntary eugenics to strengthen human genetic stock. He suggested the creation of isolated communities where healthy individuals could reproduce according to eugenic principles. And he proposed that criminals, the mentally ill, and the severely disabled should be humanely eliminated through the use of euthanasia gas chambers. This was not a metaphor. This was not hyperbole. Carrel was proposing that the state should systematically kill those deemed unfit, using the same technology of gas chambers that would, within a few years, be put to use in Nazi Germany. His book was translated into multiple languages. It was read by Adolf Hitler. It introduced the Vichy government in occupied France, where Carrel would later serve as a scientific advisor, helping to implement eugenic policies that led to the deportation and death of thousands. And this was the man who was Charles Lindbergh's closest friend, who spent years collaborating with him on medical experiments, who shared his vision of human perfectibility through science and selection. The Lindbergh perfusion pump wasn't merely a mechanical device. In Carrel's conception, it was a tool for transcending the limitations of the human body, for separating the vital organs from the corrupting influences of the whole organism, for preserving the essential elements of life in a state of suspended animation. It represented the dream of the biological aristocrat, to control life and death, to determine which organs would survive and which would be discarded, to master the process of vitality itself. Lindbergh threw himself into this work with an intensity that some found disturbing. He learned surgical techniques. He assisted in experiments. He spent hours in Carrel's laboratory working with animal tissues, perfecting the pump's mechanisms, discussing the future of human biology. He was, by all accounts, a skilled and dedicated researcher, but his motivation went beyond scientific curiosity. Lindbergh wanted to overcome death itself, to use technology to extend human life beyond its natural limits, to ensure that the superior specimens of humanity, men like himself, would not be subjected to the decay that afflicted lesser beings. This was the context in which Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was born into. Not into a normal family, but into an experiment in genetic destiny. Not to a father who would accept the limitations of a sickly child, but to a man who believed that imperfection was a crime against the future of the species. The theory that Lindbergh was responsible for his son's death rests on a specific and horrifying claim, that the child didn't die at the hands of a kidnapper, but on the operating table of a secret medical laboratory, the victim of an experimental procedure that went wrong, and that the kidnapping was staged to cover up this crime. According to researchers like Lise Pearlman, author of Suspect Number 1, The Lindbergh Kidnapping Hoax, the evidence suggests that Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was being treated for his medical conditions by Dr. Alexis Carrel and his team at the Rockefeller Institute. The theory holds that the child was brought to the laboratory for a procedure involving the removal of tissue, possibly from the thyroid gland, possibly from the carotid artery, intended to test the perfusion pump's capabilities on living human tissue. The procedure went wrong. The child died, and Lindbergh, faced with the impossibility of explaining how his son had died in a secret medical experiment, devised the kidnapping scenario to explain the disappearance of the body. This theory explains several anomalies in the official story that have troubled investigators for decades. It explains why the ladder at the crime scene appeared unused and structurally incapable of supporting an adult carrying a child. It explains why there were no footprints in the soft ground beneath the window, no signs of forced entry that would indicate a genuine break-in. It explains why Lindbergh took such immediate and total control of the investigation, refusing standard police procedures, managing the ransom negotiations himself, ensuring that no independent authority would have access to the evidence or the body until he had controlled the narrative. It explains why Lindbergh insisted on immediate cremation of the body when it was discovered, preventing a thorough autopsy that might have revealed surgical incisions or other evidence of medical intervention. It explains why the child's body was found so close to the estate, 4 miles away, rather than having been transported to a remote location by kidnappers who would have wanted to dispose of the evidence permanently. It explains why the body was partially buried in leaves, as if hastily hidden by someone who knew the area intimately, rather than dumped in a way that suggested professional criminals. And it explains the strange behavior of the child's corpse itself. The child was found with the left leg missing, the hands and feet gone, apparently taken by animals. But the skull was fractured in a way that suggested a blow or a fall, not the strangulation or suffocation that would be expected in a kidnapping murder. The decomposition was advanced. The clothing was strangely preserved. The positioning of the body suggested it had been placed in the ditch relatively recently, not left there for 72 days. If the child had died in a medical experiment, the body would have been preserved, possibly using the perfusion techniques that Lindbergh and Carrel had developed, until a suitable moment to, quote-unquote, discover it in a way that would support the kidnapping narrative. The rush to cremation would ensure that no evidence of surgical intervention would survive. The controlled discovery of the body would allow Lindbergh to manage the final stage of the cover-up. This is, of course, a theory. There is no surviving laboratory log that records Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. being brought to the Rockefeller Institute for experimental surgery. There are no witnesses who claim to have seen the child in Carrel's laboratory. The physical evidence that might have proved or disproved the theory, the body itself, was destroyed by Lindbergh's insistence upon cremation. But the theory gains credibility from what we know about Lindbergh's character, his beliefs, and his relationship with Carrel. We know that Lindbergh was capable of viewing human life through the lens of eugenics, of seeing individuals as specimens to be evaluated according to their genetic worth. We know that he was obsessed with medical technology and the possibility of extending life through mechanical means. We know that he had access to the most advanced surgical facilities in the world, and a collaborator who believed that the ends of scientific progress justified just about any means. We know that the official story has never fully satisfied critical examination. The case against Bruno Hauptmann was circumstantial at best. The handwriting evidence was disputed by experts at the time and has been questioned by modern analysts. The latter evidence was problematic. The wood grain matching was hardly definitive, and the latter's construction suggested amateur work rather than professional carpentry. The ransom money in Hauptmann's garage could have been planted, or he could have received it from a third party, or he could have found it as he claimed. Most troubling of all, Lindbergh's behavior throughout the investigation wasn't that of a father seeking justice for his murdered son, but that of a man controlling a narrative, managing information, ensuring that certain questions would never be asked. He interfered with police procedures. He managed the ransom negotiations through intermediaries he selected personally. He insisted on identifying the body himself, preventing independent verification, and he cremated the remains before a thorough autopsy could be performed. If the kidnapping was a cover-up for a medical experiment gone wrong, then Lindbergh's behavior makes perfect sense. He wasn't trying to solve a crime. He was trying to conceal one. To understand why Lindbergh might have allowed his son to be used as a medical subject, we must understand the worldview that he shared with Alexis Carrel. It was a worldview that saw human beings as material to be shaped by scientific elites, that valued the advancement of knowledge over the rights of individuals, that saw the imperfect, quote-unquote, the imperfect, as disposable. Carrel's book, Man the Unknown, wasn't merely a scientific treatise. It was a manifesto for a new kind of society, one governed not by democratic principles, but by biological necessity. Carrel argued that modern civilization was causing the degeneration of the human species, that the protection of the weak and the sick was contrary to the laws of natural selection, and that the future of humanity depended on the courage to eliminate the unfit and promote the reproduction of the superior. The book's proposals were explicit. Carrel called for the establishment of a quote-unquote high council of scientific and medical experts who would oversee the biological health of the nation. This council would have the power to determine who could reproduce and who could not. You get your fuck card. Here you go. It would establish isolated communities where healthy individuals could breed according to eugenic principles, and it would oversee the elimination of those deemed unworthy of life. Carrel was not shy about the methods. He proposed that criminals and the mentally ill should be killed in euthanasia chambers, using gas to end their lives humanely. He suggested that this would be a mercy, not a crime, that it would prevent suffering and improve the genetic stock of the human race. These were not idle speculations. Within a few years, the Nazi regime would implement exactly these policies, using gas chambers to kill millions of Jews, Roma, disabled people, homosexuals, and political prisoners. Lindbergh read the book. He discussed it with Carrel. He shared its assumptions about the importance of genetic purity and the dangers of racial degeneration. And he lived in a world where these ideas were not fringe theories, but mainstream science, endorsed by major universities, funded by major foundations, and supported by political leaders across the political spectrum. In this context, the idea that Lindbergh might have sacrificed his imperfect child to the cause of medical progress becomes less shocking. If the child was genetically damaged, if he represented a step backwards in the evolution of the Lindbergh line, then his value as a living human being was already compromised in his father's eyes. If his body could be used to advance the research that might preserve the organs of superior specimens, then his death might be viewed not as a tragedy, but as a contribution to the future of the species. This is the logic of eugenics, taken to its horrifying conclusion. The individual means nothing. The species means everything. The imperfect child is not a person to be loved and protected, but a problem to be solved, a specimen to be used, and a sacrifice to the gods of progress. And Carrel's mysticism added another dimension to this calculus. If the body was merely a vessel for vital forces, if consciousness could survive death and perhaps be contacted through telepathic means, if the soul was not bound by the limits of physical existence, then the death of the physical body was not the end of the person. The child might live on in some form, his vital energy absorbed into the greater project of human transcendence. This wasn't science as we understand it today. It was a hybrid of empirical research and occult belief, a fusion of laboratory technique and mystical aspiration that characterized much of early 20th century thought among certain elites. The same men who built the machines of modernity, airplanes, automobiles, medical devices, etc., also believed in telepathy, spiritualism, and the possibility of transcending death through technology as well. Lindbergh and Carrel represented this fusion perfectly. They were men of science who believed in miracles, engineers who believed in the soul, rationalists who pursued irrational goals. Their collaboration on the perfusion pump wasn't merely about keeping organs alive. It was about conquering death itself, about using technology to achieve what religion had promised: immortality, transcendence, and the defeat of entropy and decay. In this context, the death of a single imperfect child might seem like a small price to pay for the advancement of such a grand project. The cover-up that followed wasn't merely the concealment of a crime, but the protection of a vision, the vision of a world where superior men would use science to transcend human limitations, where the unfit would be eliminated, and where the species would evolve towards godhood. The connection between Lindbergh and the dark side of American industrial utopianism was not limited to his collaboration with Carrel. Lindbergh was also deeply connected to another project that represented the same fusion of technological ambition and social engineering: Henry Ford's attempt to build an American civilization in the Amazon rainforest. And keep in mind, also, this is a man, Ford. This is a man whose name is everywhere. You cannot drive for 5 minutes without seeing his name somewhere. So in 1927, same year that Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic, Henry Ford purchased 2.5 million acres in the Brazilian Amazon. His goal was to create Fordlandia, which I would love to see brought to life as a reverse Portlandia, where everyone is so extremely just fascist, conservative, etc., to a satirical, over-the-top degree. Be top-notch entertainment. Anywho, it was a rubber plantation that would supply his automobile empire with the raw materials needed for tires, and a social experiment that would export Midwestern American values to the jungle. Ford envisioned a perfect company town, complete with Cape Cod bungalows, white picket fences, square dancing, prohibition, and American-style industrial discipline. Lindbergh was connected to this project in multiple ways. In October 1927, Ford announced a planned 9,000-mile tour of Latin America, claiming that he would, quote, drop from the clouds like a god, unquote, into the Amazonian settlement alongside Lindbergh in the spirit of St. Louis. The specific trip never materialized, but the association was made in the public mind. Lindbergh's heroic flight and Ford's jungle utopia were linked as twin expressions of American technological destiny. More concretely, Lindbergh conducted pioneering flight path surveys across South America for Pan American Airways in 1929 and 1930. His air routes helped open the transportation networks that Ford's Brazilian operations relied upon. And in 1933, Lindbergh and Anne made a celebrated visit to Fordlandia, flying over the plantation and landing on the river, where they were greeted as visiting royalty. Fordlandia was a disaster from the get-go, straight from jump. Ford attempted to apply Detroit assembly line principles to tropical agriculture, ignoring the advice of botanists who understood the local ecosystem. Rubber trees in the Amazon grow scattered and sparse, protected by distance from the parasites and blights that prey upon them. Ford's managers planted them in tight, orderly rows, creating perfect conditions for epidemic devastation. Leaf blight, caterpillars, and plant lice swept through the plantations, destroying the trees and rendering the operation economically worthless. The social experiment was equally catastrophic. Ford attempted to impose a puritanical Midwestern lifestyle on Brazilian workers who had no interest in square dancing, oatmeal, prohibition, or the missionary position. Workers were forced to wear identification badges, attend mandatory American cultural events, eat food they found disgusting, and abstain from alcohol in sweltering tropical heat. They lived in metal-roofed bungalows that acted like ovens, working through the heat of the day according to Detroit time schedules that ignored the realities of an equatorial climate. In December 1930, the tensions boiled over into open revolt. A dispute in the cafeteria over the mandatory American food escalated into a full-scale riot. Workers smashed the clocks, severed telegraph wires, destroyed machinery, and chased managers into the jungle. The Brazilian army had to be called in to restore order. Ford's American utopia had collapsed into violence and chaos. The parallels between Fordlandia and the Lindbergh case are striking. Both represent the same hubris. Hubris. The belief that American industrial technology and social engineering could transcend local conditions, biological realities, and human nature itself. Both involved the imposition of eugenic and social control mechanisms on populations deemed, quote-unquote, inferior. Both collapsed because they ignored the complex realities of biology and culture in favor of ideological abstractions. And both were supported by Lindbergh, who shared Ford's vision of industrial civilization as a force for evolutionary progress. Lindbergh and Ford were close friends and ideological allies. They shared anti-Semitic and isolationist views. They both believed in the importance of genetic purity and the dangers of racial degeneration. They both saw technology as a tool for transcending human limitations and creating a new world order. When World War II began, Lindbergh was temporarily sidelined from military command due to his pre-war isolationist activities and his acceptance of a medal from Nazi Germany. Ford hired him as a consultant at the Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan, where Lindbergh helped optimize the production of B-24 Liberators. Even as the world fought against the regime that had implemented Carrel's eugenic proposals, Lindbergh was working for the industrialists who had attempted to build a eugenic utopia in the Amazon jungle. Fordlandia was finally abandoned in 1945 after Henry Ford's grandson, Henry Ford II, sold the entire 2.5 million acre concession back to the Brazilian government for $250,000, a fraction of the $20 million spent on the project. The synthetic rubber developed during the war had made natural rubber plantations obsolete. The jungle was already reclaiming the American village, the hospital, the watchtower, and the sawmill. Today, Fordlandia is a decaying monument to industrial hubris, home to a few thousand residents living among the ruins of an American dream that never made sense in the Amazon. The metal roofs rust. The square dance pavilion stands empty. The orderly rows of rubber trees have long since succumbed to blight. Henry Ford himself never visited the plantation. He managed the entire disaster from his office in Dearborn, Michigan, imposing his vision on a reality he never bothered to see. Lindbergh flew over it, lent his name to it, helped make it possible. And then he moved to other projects, other collaborations, other dreams of transcendence through technology. Beyond the medical experiment theory and the eugenics cover-up hypothesis, the Lindbergh kidnapping had generated a subculture of significantly darker, more esoteric interpretations. These theories move beyond the realm of documented history into the territory of ritual symbolism, occult numerology, and secret society lore. While they lack the documentary evidence that supports the medical experimentation theory, they reveal something important about how the case has been understood by those who see history as a series of hidden rituals performed by shadowy elites. The most disturbing of these theories suggests that the Lindbergh baby wasn't the victim of a kidnapping, nor of a medical experiment or accident, but of a deliberate ritual sacrifice conducted by occult networks that backed Lindbergh's rise to fame and demanded payment in blood. According to this interpretation, Lindbergh's meteoric rise to global celebrity after his 1927 flight wasn't merely the result of courage and luck, but was orchestrated or supported by elite power structures, secret societies, industrial syndicates, or occult organizations that required a specific form of payment for their assistance. The sacrifice of a firstborn child is a recurring motif in myth and ritual across cultures, representing the highest price that can be paid, the most precious gift that can be offered to secure power, protection, or wealth. In these narratives, the death of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. is interpreted as a blood pact, a horrific tribute by the occult networks that managed Lindbergh's public persona and backed his industrial ventures. The father who flew across the Atlantic, who became a god in the American imagination, and purchased his apotheosis with his son's life. This theory finds apparent support in specific details of the kidnapping that resonate with classical hermetic and sacrificial motifs. The date of the kidnapping, March 1st, 1932, falls close to specific astrological transitions preceding the spring equinox, a period traditionally associated in occult lore with rebirth and sacrificial rites. The positioning of the body in a shallow grave, partially covered by leaves, is interpreted not as panic-driven disposal, but as a deliberate symbolic act of returning the offering to the earth, a classical motif of sacrifice and renewal. Most intriguing to esoteric researchers is the symbol found on the original ransom notes, a strange design of interlocking red and blue circles with 3 punched holes in the center. While police investigators dismiss this as a criminal's attempt to create a distinctive signature, occult theorists have identified it as a geometric sigil, possibly denoting membership in a specific brotherhood or indicating the ritual nature of the operation. The colors red and blue, the circular form, and the 3 holes, these are interpreted as carrying specific symbolic weight in Hermetic traditions, suggesting that the kidnapping was marked with occult symbolism from the beginning. The interlocking circles have been compared to the Vesica Pisces, an ancient symbol with deep significance in sacred geometry, representing the intersection of 2 spheres, the union of opposites, the gateway between worlds. In some interpretations, this symbol is associated with specific secret societies or occult traditions that practice ritual sacrifice as a means of gaining power or maintaining control over worldly affairs. The 3 holes punched in the center have been interpreted variously as representing the 3 principles of alchemy, sulfur, mercury, and salt, or the threefold nature of the divine, or the 3 stations of the sun's journey. Some researchers have suggested that the symbol is a calling card, a deliberate message to those with eyes to see, quote-unquote, that this was not a simple kidnapping, but a ritual working. Whether one accepts these interpretations or dismisses them as the overactive imaginations of conspiracy researchers, they point to a deeper truth about the Lindbergh case, that it has never fully made sense as a simple crime. The anomalies, the inconsistencies, the strange behavior of the father, the convenient death of the child, the execution of a possibly innocent man. All of these have created a vacuum of meaning that alternative theories rush to fill. The occult interpretation suggests that the vacuum is not accidental, that the case was designed to be ambiguous, to generate multiple conflicting narratives, to hide the truth in plain sight behind a screen of symbols and contradictions, that the public was meant to chase kidnappers and ransom notes while the real transaction, the exchange of a child's life for his father's continued fame and fortune, took place in a realm invisible to ordinary perception. This is, of course, the logic of conspiracy theory taken to its paranoid extremes. But it's worth noting that the men at the center of this story, Lindbergh, Carrel, and Ford, were themselves believers in hidden forces, in the power of the mind to influence matter, in the existence of energies and intelligences beyond the visible world. Carrel believed in telepathy and miracles. Lindbergh believed in the transformative power of technology to transcend human limitations, and Ford believed that industrial organization could reshape human nature itself. These were men who operated in the realm of the invisible, whether that invisibility was technological, biological, or occult. They believed that the surface of events concealed deeper realities, that the apparent world was a veil, hiding the true mechanisms of power and transformation. Is it so surprising that the crime at the center of their story should appear to have hidden depths, to resist explanation at the surface level, or to generate theories that see beneath the apparent to the occult? Whether one believes that the Lindbergh baby died in a botched medical experiment, in a ritual sacrifice, or at the hands of a German carpenter named Bruno Hauptmann, one fact remains undeniable. The case was mishandled from the beginning. Evidence was destroyed or never collected, and the truth was buried beneath layers of confusion, interference, and possible corruption. Lindbergh's control of the investigation was unprecedented and inexplicable by any standard of criminal procedure. He dictated which officers could enter which rooms. He managed the ransom negotiations through intermediaries he selected personally, including the bizarre figure of John Condon, a retired school principal who claimed to have made contact with the kidnappers and who delivered the ransom money in person. He identified the body himself, preventing independent verification of the child's identity and condition. And he insisted on immediate cremation, destroying the physical evidence that might have revealed how the child actually died. The autopsy that was performed was cursory and incomplete at best. The coroner noted a fracture to the skull, but didn't determine whether it was caused by a blow, a fall, or some other mechanism. No toxicology was performed. No examination of the internal organs was conducted that might have revealed surgical intervention. The body was cremated within days of its discovery, and the ashes were scattered by Lindbergh himself. The trial of Bruno Hauptmann was a media circus that bore little resemblance to justice. The jury was sequestered under intense public pressure. The handwriting evidence was disputed by experts at the time and has been questioned by modern analysts. The latter evidence, the claim that wood from Hauptmann's attic matched wood used in the construction of the ladder found at the crime scene, was based on questionable forensic evidence that would not meet modern standards. The presence of ransom money in Hauptmann's garage could be explained in multiple ways. He claimed to have received it from a business partner who had since died, but the jury was not permitted to hear any alternative explanations. It's a huge problem with criminal proceedings in this country. Hauptmann maintained his innocence until the end, even rejecting a plea deal that would have saved his life in exchange for a confession. He was executed in the electric chair at Trenton State Prison on April 3, 1936, protesting that he had been framed, that he knew nothing about the kidnapping, and that he was an innocent man. In the decades since, evidence has emerged that suggests the possibility of a cover-up. Files have been destroyed or lost. Witnesses have recanted or died. The wood evidence has been re-examined and found to be less conclusive than claimed at trial. The handwriting evidence has been challenged by modern experts, and Lindbergh's behavior has come under increasing scrutiny as more documents have been declassified and more researchers have examined the case with critical eyes. But the truth remains elusive. Ha ha! Oh, does it ever. The body is ash. The witnesses are dead. The evidence has been destroyed or degraded over time, and we are left with theories, interpretations, and patterns that suggest but do not prove. This is the architecture of denial that surrounds the case. Not a simple conspiracy with clear boundaries and documented meetings, but a web of interference, destruction, and obfuscation that makes certainty impossible. Whether this architecture was constructed deliberately to hide a specific crime, the medical murder of a child, or whether it emerged organically from the chaos of a high-profile investigation and a father's desperate need to control the narrative, we can't say with certainty. But we can say that the case resists closure, that it continues to generate theories and questions decades after it should have been settled, that the official story has never fully satisfied those who have looked closely at the evidence, and that the men at the center of the story, Lindbergh, Carrel, and Ford, were capable of the kind of ideological fanaticism that makes even the darkest theories plausible. To understand the Lindbergh case in its full context, we must step back and see it as part of a larger pattern that characterized early 20th century American industrial culture: the worship of technology, the belief in human perfectibility through science, the embrace of eugenics, and the willingness to sacrifice individual lives to the grand projects of progress and power. This pattern has been called by many names. Some historians call it technocracy. Others call it social Darwinism. In the esoteric traditions, it's associated with the Saturnian current, the heavy, limiting, crystallizing force that binds matter and spirit, that demands sacrifice in exchange for power, that rules over death, time, and the structures of control. Saturn in the alchemical and astrological traditions is the devourer of children. He is the god who eats his own offspring to prevent them from overthrowing him. He's associated with lead, the heavy, poisonous metal that degrades the mind and binds the spirit. He rules over institutions, hierarchies, and the slow grinding of time that turns living things to stone. The men we've been examining, Lindbergh, Carrel, and Ford, were all, in their own ways, servants of the Saturnian current. They believed in control, in structure, and in the imposition of human will upon nature and upon other human beings. They believed that superior men had the right and the duty to shape the species according to their vision of perfection. They were willing to sacrifice the individual to the collective, the present to the future, and the natural to the artificial. Carrel's gas chambers, Ford's assembly lines, and Lindbergh's perfusion pump all were expressions of the same impulse to master life and death through technology, to transcend human limitations through will and machinery, to create a world where the messy realities of biology and culture were replaced by the clean lines of industrial design. And in this context, the death of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. takes on a mythic dimension. He becomes not merely a victim of crime or accident, but a sacrifice to the god of progress, an offering made by a father who believed himself to be building a better future. Whether he died on a surgical table, in a staged kidnapping, or some other manner unknown to us, his death served the narrative of transcendence that his father and his father's collaborators were constructing. The Saturnian current demands sacrifice. It demands that something precious be given up in exchange for power, knowledge, or longevity. In the ancient world, this sacrifice was explicit. Children offered to Moloch, prisoners dispatched in temple rituals, blood poured on altars to ensure the fertility of crops and the stability of the state. In the modern world, the sacrifice is hidden, disguised as accident or necessity in progress. The pattern remains the same. The lead that poisoned the workers in the tetraethyl refineries, the blight that destroyed Fordlandia, the gas chambers that Carrel proposed and the Nazis built, the child who died in Hopewell, all are sacrifices to the same God, the god of control, of perfection, and of the future that justifies any horror in the present. 80 years after Bruno Hauptmann, the Lindbergh kidnapping remains unsolved in any definitive sense. The case files are still consulted by researchers, historians, and conspiracy theorists. New books appear regularly, proposing new theories, new suspects, and new interpretations of the evidence. The case has become a kind of Rorschach test, revealing more about the obsessions of those who study it than about the event themselves. For some, it's a straightforward crime story. A poor immigrant sees an opportunity, takes a child, botches the ransom, kills the victim, gets caught, and pays the ultimate price. For others, it's a story of class conflict, the wealthy Lindberghs using their power to frame a working-class man for a crime they committed themselves. For others still, it's a medical mystery, a father covering up the accidental death of his son in an illegal experiment. For a smaller but persistent group, it's an occult thriller, a ritual sacrifice performed by elites who operate according to rules invisible to ordinary people. All of these interpretations have their evidence and their problems. All of them require leaps of faith, assumptions about human behavior, or readings of documents that are disputed by other experts. None of them can be proven beyond reasonable doubt. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the Lindbergh case was designed to be ambiguous, to resist closure, to generate endless speculation and division. Perhaps the truth isn't a single narrative, but a constellation of possibilities, all of them disturbing, none of them complete. What we can say with certainty is that the world into which Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was born was a world of dangerous ideas. Eugenics, technocracy, mystical vitalism, industrial utopianism. It was a world where men like his father and his father's friends believed themselves entitled to reshape the human species according to their vision of perfection. It was a world where the imperfect were disposable, where the ends justified the means, where the sacrifice of a child might seem a small price to pay for the advancement of knowledge or the preservation of a bloodline. Whether Lindbergh killed his son directly, allowed him to die in an experiment, staged a kidnapping to cover up an accident, or was simply the victim of a random crime, he was part of a culture that made such crimes thinkable. He was a believer in the religion of progress, a practitioner of the eugenic faith, a friend to mystics and industrialists alike who shared his vision of a transformed humanity. And in the end, perhaps that's the real lesson of the Lindbergh case. Not that we can solve the mystery of who killed Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., but that we can understand the world that made his death possible. A world of hubris and ideology, of science divorced from ethics, of power unchecked by compassion. A world where a child could become a specimen, a problem, or a sacrifice to forces that his father believed were greater than any individual life. The ladder leaning against the house, the open window, the ransom notes with their strange symbols, the body in the ditch, the rush to cremation, the execution of Bruno Hauptmann. All these are pieces of a puzzle that may never be fully assembled, but the picture that emerges from even the partial assembly is dark enough. A picture of American industrial civilization at its most arrogant, its most dangerous, and its most willing to sacrifice the innocent to the gods of progress and power. Charles Lindbergh lived until 1974, dying in Hawaii at the age of 72. He never spoke publicly about the doubts surrounding his son's death. He maintained the official story until the very end, dying in the knowledge that he had gotten away with something, or that he had been a victim of something, or simply that the truth was buried too deep to ever be recovered. Dr. Alexis Carrel died in 1944, having served the Vichy government in occupied France, having helped implement the eugenic policies that led to deportation of thousands, having never renounced his belief in miracles, telepathy, and the right of superior men to eliminate the unfit. His perfusion pump is in museums now, a milestone in medical history, separated from the dark philosophy of the man who invented it. Henry Ford died in 1947, having never visited the jungle utopia that bore his name. having lived long enough to see his vision of industrial society triumph across the world and begin to show its terrible cost. And Fordlandia still stands, or rather falls, in the Amazon jungle, rusting slowly back into the earth that it tried to conquer, a monument to the hubris of men who believed they could transcend nature, culture, and the messy realities of human limitation. The child is Ash, the mystery remains, and the game of Saturn continues, played out now in different forms, in different laboratories and boardrooms and jungle clearings, but always according to the same rules. Sacrifice the present for the future, the individual for the collective, the imperfect for the perfect, and never, under any circumstances, let the truth be known. In the end, we are left with more questions than answers. Was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. the victim of a kidnapping, a medical experiment, or a ritual sacrifice? Did his father kill him, allow him to die, or merely exploit his death for purposes we can barely comprehend? Was Bruno Hauptmann guilty, framed, or a convenient scapegoat? Did Dr. Alexis Carrel perform experiments on the child that went wrong? Did Henry Ford's industrial utopianism influence Lindbergh's view of human life as raw material to be shaped by superior men? We can't know. The evidence has been destroyed, the witnesses are dead, the body is ash scattered on the wind. We're left with documents that contradict each other, with testimonies that change over time, and with a case that has been picked over by generations of researchers without reaching consensus. But we can know something about the world that produced this mystery. We can know that it was a world where eugenics was mainstream science, where industrialists believed that they could build utopias in the jungle, where surgeons believed in telepathy and wrote books proposing gas chambers for the unfit. We can know that the men at the center of this story weren't monsters in the conventional sense, but believers, true believers. Men who thought that they were serving progress, evolution, and the future of the species. And we can know that this is the most disturbing possibility of all. Not that evil men conspired to kill a child, but that good men, or men who believed themselves good, could convince themselves that such a death was necessary, justified, or even noble. And that the worship of technology, the faith in human perfectibility, the dream of transcending natural limits, could lead to acts that look, from the outside, like murder. The Lindbergh Kidnapping is a window into a moment in American history when the country stood at a crossroads, where the dreams of industrial utopia and human transcendence hadn't yet been revealed as nightmares, and where the men who would build the modern world still believed that they could reshape the human species itself. It's a reminder that the 20th century's greatest horrors did not emerge from out of nowhere, but from the convergence of science and mysticism, of technology and eugenics, of the rational and the irrational that characterized the early decades of the century and seem to be having a bit of an upswing today. Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was born into this convergence. He lived 20 months in the shadow of his father's name, under the pressure of his father's beliefs, subject to the scrutiny of a world that saw him not as a person, but as the heir to a genetic legacy. And he died, in ways we may never fully understand, as a sacrifice to the gods that his father worshipped, the gods of flight, of progress, and of human perfectibility through will and technology. The case remains open, the mystery remains unsolved, and the warnings remain clear. When men believe themselves capable of remaking the world, when they view human life as material to be shaped by their vision, when they sacrifice the present for some imagined future perfection, the result isn't utopia but tragedy, not transcendence but death, not the elevation of the species but the destruction of the innocent. The spirit of St. Louis hangs in the Smithsonian now, another institute with a sterling reputation, a silver relic of a bygone age. The perfusion pump is in a museum, separated from the philosophy that created it. Fordlandia rusts in the jungle, and somewhere scattered on the wind are the ashes of a child who never had a chance to grow up, who was born into the wrong family at the wrong time, who became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when power believes itself to be wisdom, and when the dream of perfection becomes the justification for any atrocity. This is the legacy of the crime of the century, one of many, many crimes of the century. Not a solved case, but an enduring mystery. Not a simple story of good and evil, but a complex web of ideology, ambition, and possible murder. And not a closed chapter of history, but an open wound that reminds us, every time we look at it, of how close we came to a world where children could be sacrificed to science, where the imperfect could be eliminated for the greater good, and where the most famous man in the world could get away with the perfect crime. The game of Saturn continues. Players change, but the rules remain the same. And somewhere, in the archives and the memories and the ashes, the truth waits to be discovered, or to remain forever hidden. A sacrifice to the god of secrets, buried deep in the American soul. That's going to do it for this episode, but trust me, there's plenty more where that came from. Our Saturn series is just beginning. And keep in mind, like I said before, these are very loosely interrelated. But for any of those who are paying attention, you will definitely see the recurring motifs and ideas that make up the Saturnian current and its survival into the modern day. This has been Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lucht. I fucking love you guys. Love yourselves. Love each other, because we are all we got. Please return next time when we traverse the depths of deep weirdness to the peaks of high strangeness and the outer limits of the Twilight Zone. Peace. The chicken grease.
For Lindbergh, oh what a flying